everybody talks about the price of the land, and oftentimes we'd have this discussion or chat with a farmer, and he'd say, well, sure, there's 20 acres coming up down the road and it's going to cost me whatever. I'll get to carry more cows or whatever. But just as a nice, simple rule of thumb, whatever it's costing you, that's 30% or 35% of what the feed will cost brought onto the farm. So do them sums up and then look at it, whether it makes sense.
Hello, I'm James Dunn, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights, and opinions to improve dairy farm performance. Following on from the recent Teagasc National Dairy Conference, I'm delighted to be joined today by Donal Patton, who was involved in one of the workshops titled Stock and Rate Decisions of Future Dairy Systems. So Donal, thanks a million for joining us today. I suppose we'll get straight into it, and not say you're a long time in terms of dairy systems research, but you're around Ballyhis a little while at this stage. So in terms of the fundamentals, Donal, of our dairy systems, I suppose, what's the basis, maybe as a good starting point in terms of our dairy systems? What's the driver of them?
Not a lot has changed from that point of view, James, in the last number of years. It's really around being able to feed that cow as cheaply as we can, and if you look at the costs or the total costs of our systems, feeding the cow is a big part of that. So we can all know that grass is a big part of that. Grazed grass utilised, and we'll talk a little bit about that, I suppose, the difference between those two things. But look, fundamentally, we're trying to feed the cow as cheaply as we can, but also getting high level of performance out of the animal. So look, when you break it down, it's a cow that's eating 3.5 ton dry matter of grazed grass. She's eating 1.5 tons or thereabouts of silage, and she's eating somewhere between 0.5 ton and 1 ton of concentrate. I think that's kind of your system. Different people will be, to one side or the other of that in terms of meal feeding, but the big thing is that we're getting the level of output out of the cow, and that's somewhere 480, 500. There's individual farmers out there doing 550, some guys doing up to 600 kilos of solids, and that's great. But once it's coming from high levels of forage being utilised by the cow, that's the real driver of performance and economically.
So big thing there is ultimately, as you say, that performance is one thing, but really your point is it has to be driven off forage and forage utilised.
It does, yeah.
Sorry, Donald. We heard from both David Becca and Joe Patton on the day in terms of forage utilised per hectare then. So where does whole farm stock and rate, I suppose, fit with that in terms of you kind of framed individual cow budget and what you want it to look like? That whole area of whole farm stock and rate then in terms of where it actually fits.
Yeah, well, I suppose when you look at that, like you've got, as I say, you've got your 3.5 ton of grazed grass, you've got your 1.5 tons of silage, and then whatever 0.5 ton to 1 ton of concentrate. That's what's going to go into the cow to feed her. So in terms of whole farm stock and rates, and I suppose it's something that we're seeing quite a bit in the last number of years as genetics has improved, calving pattern has improved in a lot of farms, so guys are calving more compactly. The capacity of the cow we have now versus what we had 15 years ago in terms of output from forage is, it's getting better and better and better. But the flip side of that is we need to have the feed to put into the animal. So, if we want the higher level of performance, we need the feed there to put into the animal. So when you do the sums back on it, James, I suppose, whole farm, you're talking about, I know we were doing it recently actually for Ballyhis here, and the figure I was coming up with was about 2.3 of a stock and rate whole farm. And that's at a sort of 500 kilos of solids output level. Growing 14 ton and doing a good job on utilization. Now, look at obviously a year like this year, utilization was most definitely a challenge here. But, 1 year with the next year, growing 14 ton, and that's growing 14 ton across all your acres, which is, hard done. There's not many commercial farmers out there doing it across all their acres. So I suppose, it's 2.3, like up to 2.5 at that level of performance. You need to be growing 15 ton and utilising 80% of it, which again is the next band up. But I think anywhere from 2.2, 2.3 is a pretty good target whole farm stock on it.
And for that, I suppose, in terms of what have you factored in there, really, what are you looking for? You're looking for self-sufficiency in feed, and
Correct.
you're looking to build a buffer in there as well, Donald, or
No, look at 2.3. I think 1 year with the other, you'll work out okay in terms of, I wouldn't say build a buffer, but there's a little bit of scope or a little bit of maneuver in there that you're not just. But self-sufficiency is a big part of it, like because I suppose as you move on through the stocking rates, the higher level of stocking rate, we need to have control of our total feed budget. We need to have control
mm,
of the feed. And look, at there's individual farmers out there will buy in a proportion of their winter feed, and that's fine. But it does leave you more exposed. So years like last year, this year, you'll be more exposed to higher levels of feed costs, or cost of forage will increase. So I suppose, yeah, at the 2.3, feeding sort of 700-800 kilos of concentrate, which is normal enough for us, you're talking about being self-sufficient at that thereabouts.
so you've alluded to it there in terms of, I suppose, if you're stocked higher than that, ultimately you need to be growing more grass, 14 and a
Correct.
half, 15 ton. And just,
Correct.
I suppose, for our listeners, it's important, and that's something that came through loud and clear on the day in the workshop, and we'll come to maybe outblocks in a minute, but that's ultimately across all your hectares.
Yeah.
Often those decisions don't, I see that myself at farm level, they're often made on maybe what the milking platform's growing, and there can be massive variation in terms of what these outblocks are actually delivering.
Correct. And it's something even around the time of the conference, talking to David Becca, he was sort of saying we should be putting more effort into, and I'd agree with him on that, in getting an idea of what the blocks are actually doing. And
Mm,
it's easier actually to do than on your grazing platform, because it's 3 cuts a year or 2 or 3 cuts a year that you need to get a sort of a good handle on what sort of level of performance they're doing. So yeah,
mm.
definitely that's the 14 ton across every hectare, which, as I said, is quite hard to do.
Is it something as easy for, I suppose, if we've listeners there that ultimately over the next number of weeks maybe want to have a look at this for their own farm, maybe something as easy as doing the back calculation to, and may not be 100% accurate, but ultimately it'll give people a good idea in terms of where their own farm system is at.
Most definitely, it gives you a great idea, because, um, measuring grass, where we want everybody to be measuring and utilizing what they have better and all that. But for, I suppose, the purpose of this, James, is really look at how much feed came in onto the farm, um, whether that be concentrate or purchase forage, how much milk or milk solids went out of the farm, how many animals did you have. If you have those few bits of information, which generally aren't that hard to gather up, with a bit of help with your advisor, you can work out, you can do the back calculations, usually you can work it out, and you can have a pretty good stab at what the farm is doing as a whole. Because oftentimes we'll see at farm level, or when you're dealing with discussion groups, an individual farmer, he could be growing 16 ton or 15 ton on his platform, and that's fine. But when you do that back calculation out, he might only be utilizing, 10 ton across the whole farm,
Mm.
and that's alluding to the fact that outblocks are underperforming in a big way. So I think it's a good sum to do, even do it in conjunction with your profit monitor meeting.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I often heard you explaining it to farmers in terms of, and I just want to maybe have the conversation. If you do exceed it, it's a bit like an energy in and energy out budget as such. How much energy can you produce on the farm, and ultimately in terms of how much are you selling out the gate. But if you do exceed that, or what's the telltale signs for our listeners in terms of if they're starting to think, have I went a little bit too far type of thing? Am I not growing enough grass? What's the telltale signs for our listeners?
Yeah, well, the energy in, energy out thing, I kind of always say that to lads, like, don't try and beat, don't try and beat the equation, because you can't beat it. Like, so, so much energy goes into the farm, so much energy comes out. That's it. Your farm is not special. Okay, your cows could be slightly better at converting it to milk solids or whatever, but in the broad scheme of things, you're not going to beat that equation. So I suppose the telltale signs when you know the thing is going a little bit out of whack is it kind of it manifests itself one of two ways. Either one, you end up buying in excessive amounts of forage, winter forage. So I'm sort of saying, you're spending 10, 15, 20,000 at a normal scale farm on forage every year that's coming off off your own land that you're going out and purchasing forage. If that's happening, there's something a little bit out of whack. The other one, which I think is actually more common, is that people will do what they can do within the constraints of their own farm to have enough forage, which is fine, it's fair enough, but they can actually end up restricting the level of cow performance. So if you're a person who's picking the right bulls, doing, using AI, doing all the right things, and you look back and you go, Jesus, my performance hasn't moved on a per cow level over the last 5-6 years. That to me is telling you that, you're limiting that cow. So that often manifests itself. The one I see that often happens is in the month of May, June, the months of May and June, when you should be giving the cow her full potential or getting up to her full potential intake, guys are, because they're tight and they're worried about making enough silage, they're closing up too much area, and essentially restricting the cows. Now, it might be only by 2 kilos or a kilo, 2 kilos of forage, and if they're well-bred animals, they may still go and calf, but the performance will drop. A really good telltale sign there is if you look at your crop report and you look at the protein percentage. If you look at the protein percentage, sort of March should be your lowest month, and then it should be ticking up from there along. Oftentimes you'll see March, it'll go up in April, and then in May and June it'll tank, and then it'll steady in July, and it'll start. If you see that sort of drop in May, June, July, it's a pretty good sign that you're restricting your cows.
Lovely. And I suppose maybe then to move on, we spoke about that kind of whole farm stock convert piece, and within that, obviously, as we said, there's outblocks, I suppose. Explain the role, I suppose, as it is today in terms of outblocks that play in our systems, and what you see. There was great discussion, I suppose, around this topic. What's your own thinking on outblocks within our current dairy systems model?
Yeah, I suppose some people may think we're a bit negative towards outblocks, and we're not at all. I think they have a role, and a very important role to play. The first thing is, if we spent a wee bit of time at this in preparation for the conference, like if you sit back and you look at it logically, like the cow is eating, 5 ton of forage, 1.5 tons of that, give or take. I know for Ballyhaise, that's kind of our figure. 1.5 tons dry matter that is silage. Okay, if you're on a very free draining farm in the south of the country and you can get more days of grass, it might be a bit less than that. But for us, it's 1.5 tons. It's sort of, when you work it out 240 days, it's, 14 or 15 kilos of dry matter per day. So that's 30% of the forage going down the cow's throat goes down in the form of silage. So if you extrapolate that out, what that basically says to me is that if you have 30% of your land area that's a mile down the road or 2 miles, or basically that you can't walk cows to, it has very little effect on how efficiently you can run the system. Now, what I mean by that, James, is that, when I've talked to lots of contractors about this, if you do the costings on silage made in paddock 30, that you can walk the cows to, but it's a mile, a kilometre and a half, or whatever it is. Yep. Exactly. Or you make it 2 miles down the road. The costings of making that silage is a little bit more, but in the broad scheme of things, it's next to nothing. Okay, getting slurry to it again a little bit more costly, but it's not massive, it's not huge. So the point I'm sort of trying to make is that up to 30% of your land base, okay, if that's a way, it's really efficient. You can, in other words, you can take on land outside your milking platform to increase scale, and you can utilize that land to a really, really good effect. Okay. That's if you're cows only, if there's no young stock in the system. If you've got sort of 20% young stock, which is, your bare minimum really in terms of replacement rate, you could say, you can go to 40% of your land as being outblock and still be, a perfectly balanced system. You're not restricting the amount of days of grass. It'll work really well and be very profitable. If you have a higher level of young stock, obviously that ticks up. Now, there's a couple of things about this, I suppose. The first thing I'll say is that if the percentage gets out of whack, okay, so if your cow's only no young stock, and instead of 70-30, you're at 50-50. So 50% of your land away, 50% of your land that you can graze. What that says to me is either one of two things. Either number one, that land away is very unproductive or less productive than it should be, which is the case on an awful lot of farms. Or number two, if say that land away is very productive and home is very productive and you stock it as such, what generally happens there is you're starting to reduce your days of grass, and that 3.5 ton of grazed grass down the cow's neck becomes 3 ton or 2.7 ton or whatever it is. And no matter how you skin that cat, that leads to higher feed costs. Bringing it in, and we'll talk about that maybe in the next section, but bringing that feed in as silage, it leads to higher feed costs. So the role, as I see it, of outblocks as it currently is, I suppose, is your 70%, 30% is a good rule of thumb, guys. Only young stock, it could be 40 to 50%. When it starts getting out of whack from that, you have to ask yourself the question, is my outblocks productive enough? And if they are, is it leading me down a road of a very intensive system at home, I suppose?
Yeah, that's the big one in terms of what you're saying there is if we start impacting on that kind of grazing season length, the amount of grazed grass we get into our cows, then ultimately, and you've seen this where costs are going to significantly rise then.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act, really, Donald.
It's a balancing act, and I've talked to lots of lads. Was at a couple of the different conferences there in the autumn, and different guys I'd know for years that are really good grazing guys, focused on grass, as good as you get anywhere. And they're sort of saying to me, oh, geez, I'm finding that I'm feeding more silage, in the shoulders, and I'm doing this and I'm doing, and you ask that question, well, where have you moved in the last 10 years? Well, I used to be at sort of 2.5 on the platform. I'm now at 3.5 or 3.7 or 3.8. It's perfectly, that's what's going to happen. There's going to have to go more feed in, which is going to increase our cost of production. And you saw the stuff that David presented. It's not in Ireland, it's around the world. Once the level of grazed pasture going into the diet reduces, the costs of feeding the cow is going to increase. That's what I'm saying. Don't try and beat the equation. That's just what's going to happen.
I'm coming back maybe to that 3.5 ton of grazed grass, and something I probably should have asked you earlier, but kind of growing that 13 to 14 ton on the milking platform. Where is then the sweet spot to get that into our cows ultimately? Where's the upper limit there then in terms of that stocking rate on the home block?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's another good way of looking at a good sort of rule of thumb for people. If you take a 3.5 ton, utilizing 80% through grazing, growing 14 to 15 ton, you're talking about somewhere between 3 and 3.5 of a stocking rate. Like, I know some guys running at that 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, they're the top operators, and they're really good at what they do. The one thing about that is that you still need a significant amount of silage at times of the year. Like, the further you go up that, I mean, in the milk and cow diet, and it's something that I suppose I didn't mention on the outblock thing, but one of the roles of the outblocks is actually producing that really, really good quality silage to feed, particularly the further you go up. But I would say 3 to 3.5. 3.5 is kind of the tops. Once you go above 3.5, and that's at a very high level of grass growth and utilization, you end up in a situation where you're housing at night till the middle of March, you're back in on the 10th of October, all this sort of stuff. The very same effect can happen to a fella who goes from 2.5 to 3 if he's only growing 12 ton. I've seen that happening too. And I suppose that's why I'm trying to bring it back to these rules of thumb that farmers can identify with. Like, if you're looking and you're saying, geez, I used to be a man that was out day and night from the middle of February, and now I find them in at night until the middle of March. Well, that's an alarm bell ringing straight away to say, well, look, that means you're probably pushing a little bit too high. So that figure, and I'm not avoiding the figure for very productive farms is 3 to 3.5. The figure for farms that have work to do on soil fertility is probably 2.5 to 3.
Yeah, so if that's what I was going to come to. If you're growing 11.5 ton, ultimately you probably shouldn't be crossing that kind of 3 threshold.
No.
Or ultimately,
No,
as you said,
not.
there's going to be a lot of silage coming into the system then.
Absolutely.
I suppose then maybe to to follow it on a little bit, and sure, obviously there's a big question out there in terms of additional lands, and that's maybe being driven a little bit around changes to the nitrate irrigation, obviously. But um, I think it's important, and this came through in terms of the workshop, that how would farmers actually assess this? We seen very, very high land rental prices being given last spring, Donald, and you'd wonder in terms of the basis of that and the assessments done. In your opinion, I suppose, how would our listeners go about assessing further opportunities, I suppose, for this additional outside land?
Yeah, well, I suppose the first thing to say is farmers want to move on. Like, farmers don't want to stand back or stay steady. And that makes perfect sense. Lads have, if we think about where we were in 1984 when quotas came in and where we are now, it's just like a completely different landscape. And that was all driven by individual farmers who took risks and moved on. But the thing of the outblocks, and so much has changed even in the last 5 years and all this sort of stuff. So the way I would look at it is the core, and it goes back to, the core of how it affects the system at home. So if you're in a situation where there's a hole in the feed budget, so in other words, you're buying in a lot of silage or whatever, and, land comes up, you do the sums on it and it makes sense, then go and do it. It's a great opportunity for you, you know. But if the additional cows that you're going to carry by taking on this extra land is going to put you over that 3 or 3.3 stocking rate or whatever we're saying, basically that you won't be able to utilize a 3.5 ton of grazed grass on the platform, then it's something that should be approached with caution because it's putting you into a different cost band or cost of production band, and it's something people should really think about, So, and I think we've sort of covered that pretty well. So basically, how it affects that utilization of grazed grass at home. That's the first thing. Um, the second thing then, I suppose, is that, and when we were doing up the sums for the dairy conference, it was an interesting one when we sat back and we looked at it. Like everybody talked about the price of land last year and the price of land this year, and it has gone crazy. But even at those sort of levels of land price, I think we took something like 350 or 400 an acre. I think it was about 350 an acre we took.
350, Donald, yeah.
Yeah, in the analysis. That was only a third of the cost of the feed that came into the yard. So the cost, everybody talks about the price of the land, and oftentimes we'd have this discussion or chat with a farmer, and he'd say, "Well, sure, there's 20 acres coming up down the road, and it's going to cost me whatever." But sure, it makes perfect. I'll get to carry more cows or whatever. But just as a nice simple rule of thumb, whatever it's costing you, that's 30% or 35% of what the feed will cost bringing into brought onto the farm. So do them sums up and then look at it whether it makes sense. I suppose the other thing is, individually at farm level, look at your situation as it currently stands. Are you a very productive farm, as in highly productive cows? All the basic sort of targets around fertility and cow performance. If that's all good, it puts you in a much stronger position. If those things are a bit shaky, I would be focusing on them first before I'd be looking at bringing in extra land into the system. And then I suppose obviously the infrastructure, and this is if the extra land is used to plug an existing hole in the feed gap, or gap in the feed budget, that's one thing. But if it's been used to take on more cows, look at the infrastructure at home and see, is that doable? Have I got extra slurry storage? Have I got the cubicle spaces? Is my parlour big enough? And labour as well, I suppose. So that's the framework that we would use, and to do the sums for your own farm, not for somebody else's or what somebody else in the discussion group said. Do the sums for your own farm and say, right, tracking on this land is going to cost me X, but having the extra cows is going to bring in Y. Does it make sense? And if you do it and it's break even and you want to take a punt on it, well, you done it in an informed way. You didn't just decide to take the land. I suppose they're really the things that I would be thinking about, is the effect at home, the effect on the overall feed budget, and then, have you got the infrastructure to carry extra animals if that's what you want to do?
Well, I think that's excellent. I think it's very, very clear. So I suppose maybe to summarize what I've got from our chat, Donald, ultimately is the big one is focus on forage utilized on a per cow basis and on a whole farm basis. Match your own stock and rate to whatever the capabilities of your farm is to grow grass, and be careful not to exceed that. Do the back calculation maybe as a good starting point, Donald, and understand your own figures. Make sure outblocks are performing, folks. Very, very simply, just get an understanding in terms of what outblocks are actually doing, and maybe pay a bit of attention to those over the next couple of seasons. And then the big one around that additional land is really assess your own situation, and as you say, Donald, do the sums.
Yep, that's it.
Look, thanks a million, Donald. I suppose that's it for this week's episode of The Dairy Edge. I want to thank Donald for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget, folks, to rate, review and subscribe, and listen on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm James Dunn, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.